It's reported hundreds of women and children with suspected links to Islamic State militants have escaped from a camp in northern Syria. Families are said to have broken out as Turkish troops intensified their assault against Kurdish-led forces in the area. At least 9 people were reported killed when Turkish airstrikes hit a convoy of civilians and fighters, a convoy which our international editor Lindsey Hilsum had been travelling with earlier in the day. And just to warn you, there are extremely distressing images in her report.
They set off in hope, knowing the front line would be dangerous, knowing their American protectors had abandoned them. They still have American armoured vehicles, which they use to defeat the Islamic State, but nowhere near enough to counter Turkey's huge modern military. All these people say that they're going to the front line. Most of them appear to be civilians mixed in with the fighters. Some might say, are they human shields? But they say they're going to defend their land. But you are civilians, are you not afraid?
نعم شرنا ترسل أفهش صالة أردوغان سرسري ما شردكي أم ناطرسل.
But belief in a cause doesn't stop airstrikes and artillery. Are you afraid for the children? They pulled up about 20 miles before the frontline town of Ras Al Ain. It seems crazy, even criminal, to let civilians go to the most dangerous border zone. But the Kurds of Syria feel betrayed, desperate and furious.
الأمريكا كانوا داعم لنا بالأول بس بعدين بالمحنة يعني ما لهم رأي يعني بالليل يقولوا الشكل والصبح يقولوا الشكل فما بنعرف نتمنى إنه يوضحوا لنا يا هنا يكونوا معنا يا يتخلوا عنا واحدة من الاثنين.
And they are on their own now, with their female fighters and socialist ideology. Their leaders have kept close to the PKK, the Kurds fighting the Turkish state, an ill-advised, fateful policy, because their enemy Turkey is constant and their friend America is feckless.
والله أنا كأقول مبردان إذا ما قرياي خوياي يا إن شاء الله وباش هذي ما تهيئ وباش إن شاء الله.
You might have thought they were going to a wedding, not a war. But the songs are all about victories and defeats of yesteryear. The Kurds are used to betrayal and tragedy. We decided to accompany them no further. It was just too dangerous. Shortly after the convoy entered Ras Al Ain, a Kurdish reporter was broadcasting live on Facebook. All was calm until the Turks attacked from the air. He survived. I can't carry on broadcasting, he said. Others are dead. Most of the pictures are too awful to show. At least 9 people were killed, more than 70 injured. Were any of them those we met on the road? I have no way of knowing. All I know is that hope and determination could not save them.
Well, Lindsey joins us on the phone now. Lindsey, lots of breaking news on this story. What is the very latest?
Well, Kathy, the reason that I'm on the phone, not in Vision, is because we have had to leave Kurdish, which is the town where we were, and are now on the move to a safer place. This is because the Kurds, having been abandoned by the Americans, have done a deal with Bashar al-Assad, the Syrian regime, and by extension with Russia. And Bashar al-Assad is moving his forces into the towns of Kobani and Manbij. That's quite a long way to the west of where we were. But they believe that he will also take over Kurdish. There was a small force there already. This is a question of survival. The reason the Kurds have done this deal, maybe you could call it a deal with the devil. It's because it's the only way to save their people's lives. But it is the end of their dream. They had a state here, a statelet, and it wasn't perfect, and it wasn't entirely stable. but they were trying to do something. They did beat the Islamic State with the help of the Americans, who have now, in their eyes, betrayed them. They did manage to have some kind of functioning authority. For every man who ran any organization in the municipality, for example, there was also a woman. There were women fighters. They had an ideology, and they were trying to do something here which was different. I saw one of my Kurdish friends in tears tonight. He said, I don't know what will become of us. What will happen to us now? We have no friends. Everybody betrays us. This is the end of everything we had hoped to build.
Lindsey, thank you very much for joining us there. Well, earlier today, the American Defense Secretary said President Trump had directed him to begin a deliberate withdrawal of troops from northern Syria.
We now know, we believe, that the Turks now intend to go further south than originally expected and to go both west and east, which would increase their zone from beyond a 30-kilometer depth and nearly 440 kilometers wide. At the same time, we've learned in the last 24 hours that it looks like the SDF is cutting a deal with the Syrians and Russians. They're cutting a deal, and now what we're facing is U.S. forces in trapped between a Syrian-Russian army moving north to take on the Turkish army that is moving south. It puts us in a terrible position, and the protection and safety of our service members comes first to me.
Well, let's speak now to our foreign affairs correspondent, Jonathan Rugman, who's in Achakale on Turkey's border with Syria. Jonathan.
Kathy, as Lindsey was just saying there, it appears as if the Kurdish dream of autonomy in northern Syria is pretty much over. They have decided to return to the fold of President Assad's murderous regime rather than face an onslaught from the Turks. Now, we don't know how the Turks are going to respond to Syrian government forces returning to the Turkish border, whether they will now abandon their plan for a buffer zone and reach some kind of accommodation with President Assad. I think world leaders are struggling, scrambling to keep up with what is going on here. Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, spoke to President Erdogan earlier today, urged him to implement an immediate ceasefire, didn't appear to have any effect. Boris Johnson talked to the Turkish president yesterday and offered to stand by in some kind of mediating, negotiating role, to which President Erdogan replied today, what kind of prime minister is it who offers to mediate between us and terrorists? So a real slap in the face for Boris Johnson there, in the sense that President Erdogan is listening to nobody at the moment.
Well, you've talked about the phone call there. How do you think the British government more broadly in the days ahead will respond to this?
Well, we'll see what happens at a meeting of European foreign ministers in Luxembourg tomorrow. The Germans and the French have announced arms bans. We've seen reports of hundreds of ISIS sympathizers escaping from a camp today. As Lindsey was saying, there are allegations now of war crimes carried out both by Syrian Arab proxies carrying out executions yesterday, airstrikes today, apparently killing civilians, including a journalist. So it may be too late to stop President Erdogan, but I think the option of doing nothing is not much of an option either. I think Turkey is rapidly emerging under President Erdogan as a rogue state on Europe's borders, and in the words of the US Defense Secretary, spinning out of the West's orbit.
Jonathan, thanks very much. Well, just before we came on air, I spoke to the President and CEO of the International Rescue Committee, David Milliband, and I began by asking for his reaction to today's events.
All of our worst fears are being realized. The so-called safe zone is becoming a death trap, and the winners out of this are clearly ISIS, who seem to be having some fighters escape, but also the Assad government. It's seen a shift in the terms of power between the Kurds and President Assad. He's now able to either move in or leverage a greater influence in the northeast of the country. And the irony of all this is that until a week ago, the northeast of Syria was one of the more stable parts of the country. We've got International Rescue Committee teams in the northeast and the northwest, and the northeast was the place where we were better able to program to meet humanitarian needs, which are extensive, compared to the northwest, which is like the Wild West. The northeast was relatively stable thanks to the presence of the American troops and who were holding the ring. And that obviously creates enormous humanitarian as well as political and military danger.
And how fearful are you that when Turkey says it wants to resettle millions of refugees in that area of Syria. How fearful are you that what that actually means is ethnic cleansing?
Well, I think it means ethnic adding rather than ethnic cleansing. What it means is that some of the 3.7 million Sunni Arabs who've taken refuge in Turkey from the Syrian civil war. Turkey's done an amazing job, one has to say that, with the refugees, far outstripping any other nation. But the pledge by President Erdogan at the United Nations a couple of weeks ago to send Sunni Arabs into the Kurdish area of Syria is obviously dangerous because it threatens to set up Kurdish-Arab clashes, not just Kurdish-Turkish clashes. And if indeed the Kurdish forces, the YPG, do take up asymmetric arms against the Turks, then that only adds to the conflagration. We're very concerned. We're hearing reports of war crimes, the bombing of civilians, the targeted killing of civilians. And this route is becoming a further poster child for this age of impunity where international law and norms are violated on a daily basis.
And it seems tonight that things are about to get even more bloody. There's reports that the Syrian army is poised to enter 2 Kurdish areas as part of an apparent deal with Kurdish-led forces. What might that result in, do you think?
Well, obviously, there's grave concern that the Kurds who see the Turkish military might, on one hand, are forced to sue for a deal with the Assad regime against which they've been pitted for a very long time. We don't know yet the terms that the Assad regime will require of the Kurds, but obviously the danger for the civilians, for the Kurdish civilians, is that they are the meat in the sandwich. On the one hand, you've got the Turks coming from the north, then you have Assad's forces from the south, and that is a recipe for further disaster, frankly, because there's no way that that's going to offer stability in the short or the medium term.
So what should the international community do about this? There's been several EU countries suspending arms exports to Turkey. Should the UK do likewise? And should the US levy those sanctions that they've been talking about for a while?
Well, obviously, there is British law that says arms should not be sold for internal repression or external aggression. So there's an immediate case to answer. The great problem for Britain, obviously, is that our foreign policy has been castrated by the Brexit process. There's well-founded reports that the National Security Council never had its meeting earlier this year that was supposed to cover the issue of what to do about British-born ISIS fighters and their return. The big player is the US, and there is a monumental backlash here against President Trump's decision just a week ago. Republicans and Democrats are wading in to say that this move is dangerous for national security. There's a congressional resolution that is on the verge of being passed calling for sanctions against Turkey. Obviously, from my point of view, the absolute prerequisite is a new round of diplomacy, and it's deeply distressing that the UN Security Council should have been unable to call even for a ceasefire when it met last Thursday. That's where the pressure needs to start, because until you get a ceasefire to try and figure out how to protect the civilians and organize some kind of political round table, you're not going to be able to bring any kind of hope to the people who are trapped in the middle of this appalling scene at the moment.
David Milliband, thanks very much.